Hi, my name is Matthew Pose with Audioholics, and today we're going to be looking at a multi-room amplifier from Juke Audio. Alright, so today I'm going to be reviewing basically a product that I received from Juke Audio for multi-room audio. Now, we don't do a lot of multi-room audio stuff, but you know, with the smart home, the Gene built, my own home, which has some smarts to it, it actually became an interesting opportunity to start to review products that are typically permanently installed in-wall speakers, in-ceiling speakers, patio systems that would rely on some sort of essentially like a 6 to 12 channel amplifier or more, and some way of distributing sound to those in what are called zones and sources. So all the different places you would put it, those are your zones. All the ways in which you would present music to it, that would be your sources. So typically with home theater receivers, you might get a zone 2 or a zone 3. There might be some ways to distribute different sound to different zones, but often those features are very limited and the reliability is not great. On top of that, typically the receivers don't have extra amplifier channels that you can use for those purposes. So what do you do if you want to have speakers in your bathroom, your bedroom, your living room, your patio area? Maybe you have more than one. And you want to be able to get sound out to them, well, you end up having to get into more specialized products. Now, those products tend to be very expensive. They often have to be installed by professionals, and the apps are often not that good, to be honest. So the way in which you send music isn't necessarily as convenient as the phone apps that you might have for your receiver or your processor. And so one of the problems that I've faced with trying to be able to do this in wherever I've lived, so that I can provide a way for my wife, for instance, to play music, or my kids, is that they don't really want to be able to download apps on their phone. They don't necessarily like the music services that I like, and as a result, they end up trying to do things like play music on YouTube on their phone, which is not great. So what do you do to be able to fix that? Well, you rely on something that has a more open infrastructure. And so one of the options is actually AirPlay and AirPlay 2 from Apple. There are alternatives for Android, but for the most part, AirPlay is part of Apple's ecosystem. It's relatively unique to them, and it provides the ability to stream a music source on your phone or a sound source to any device that can receive AirPlay. And so you can use any sound source, meaning YouTube is fine, as is anything else, like maybe there's a radio station that has an app to it that you like. So you can use any of those sources and stream them out to any AirPlay device. In my own house, I have this Pioneer receiver that's, I'll be doing a whole review on this later too. So this is being used for the family room. This is AirPlay 2. I have this Marantz processor that's being used in the theater. This is AirPlay 2 as well. And then down here we have the Juke Audio 6. This is a 6-zone, 4-source multi-room audio device, and primarily, its only way of sourcing music to those zones is AirPlay, and it does AirPlay 2 as one of the source options, regular AirPlay, and then there actually is this accessory device you can buy. It's a USB audio converter. Basically, it's an AD converter that plugs in like a sound card would. This is essentially a computer inside of this. And so that allows you to have an analog source. So you have the one analog source for each one of these, and you can plug up to 2 of these in. So you could have analog sources. But for the most part, for instance, for what I do, there'd be no reason to do this. I have it for testing purposes, but actually AirPlay was what I wanted. And that's because I knew that that would be easier for my wife to use. Now, certainly there are other devices out there that have these capabilities, but this thing is really affordable. The MSRP on the Juke 6 is basically under $1,500. I believe it's $1,200 or $1,300 for this one. I will put in the correct price once I confirm that. But it makes it on the much cheaper side of things for a multi-room audio device like this, allowing you to have sound in different rooms at a relatively affordable price. It's really easy to use and set up. In fact, while I did have professionals who were doing installation of this rack come in to help me with that, the only thing professionals did was plug it in, and they wired it up. They actually wired it in correctly initially by accident because some wires were mislabeled, and so I actually needed to go in and rewire it. I did that myself. It took all of a few minutes. I then set the device up myself. There is no app for it. There's actually just a login you go to that gives you the features. It's like an IP address that you go to that lets you have an interface to use. It looks like an app, it works like an app, but any computer device that can access this can do that. I have this set on my phone, I have it saved. You don't actually need it for very much. The only reason you would use it is to set up the zones. You can label them, you can figure it. The other thing you would do is if you want to send different sources to different zones or the same source to different zones, this is the way that you set it up. And so that's the only real reason you need to do that. If there's only one way you're going to do that ever, once you've set that up, you don't technically need to use that again. And then you can just use AirPlay to play music. In my case, I do play around with where I send music. So I have currently at least patio speakers on the lanai area. I will be expanding that to something bigger yet in the future, but for now, just one set of speakers out there, one set of speakers in the bedroom, a set of speakers in the bathroom, and that's it. Those are my 3 zones basically that I'm using this with. I then also have the Pioneer receiver doing the family room system, and through AirPlay 2, I can actually select zones in a sense using AirPlay 2. I can have this one going and I can have the Juke going, but then separately I can select my zones within the Juke interface itself. And so I could have the patio going, the bedroom going, the bathroom going, either separately or all together. And then again, I could be in the bedroom listening to my music and my wife could be outside with her friends listening to her own music. And that's something that can very easily be accomplished with this, which is not as easy sometimes with products like these receivers for doing multi-zone. So it's a cool product in that regard. Now, one thing that I'll say in terms of pros and cons. Pros, like I said, very easy to use and set up. It's very affordably priced for what it is. And it provides a lot of zones and a relatively high number of sources as well. And I started looking into different options. This actually was competitive with some of the better products on the market in that regard. And that is great, but here are the cons. To keep it simple to use, it has very little features. So there's no bass or treble controls. So if your speakers don't have enough bass, oh well. There's no DSP or EQ. So again, if you're trying to fine tune the sound, nothing you can do about that. It's just not there. Now they've talked about adding it in the future. That would be cool, but it's not a part of how it's set up right now. The amplifiers are not particularly powerful. They're only putting out about 20-25 watts per channel. Now, what I found was that, yeah, I can push these amps to clipping and I can hear and yeah, absolutely it falls apart. I had to do that on purpose to really find that to be noticeable. Given how I typically use the bedroom speakers, the bathroom speakers, and the patio speakers, I don't find this to be an issue. And in fact, because it has 12 amplifier channels, I can always combine zones. So you could technically bridge them, that is an option. But more realistically, you could just add more speakers to that area you're trying to fill with sound. Now, I did actually compare this to a more powerful amplifier. So here you can see I have a Blue Sound. It's a power node, I believe it's called, and it has 80 watts per channel. So this is more than twice as powerful. It's going to give at least probably 4 decibels more output than the Juke would. And so I used this in the bedroom and compared it to what I got with the Juke. Clearly, better bass, more output, less likely to clip. But for more casual listening, there wasn't a huge difference in the sound quality. They tended to sound very similar. So if you are using, what I have in the bedroom is actually an 8-inch 3-way speaker. If you do have something that can really take advantage of more power, you can add an external amplifier to the Juke by using a line level converter. It's a little bit clunky, but it actually works fine. Or maybe there's a different product that makes sense for you. But for most people looking for a simple installation, the 25 watts actually turned out to be enough. In terms of sound quality, it's not going to be comparable to the best audiophile sound products in the market, but given its use case, I don't really think that that's a problem. So in my bedroom, in my bathroom, and in the lanai area, there is no way I'm going to hear, for instance, an even quieter, lower distortion amplifier. I think if anything, the biggest thing you would hear would be the benefits of a more powerful amplifier. And as I said, you could always use this device as is, but in those particular zones where you do need more amplification, simply use a line level converter. It'd be great if it had RCA outputs, but the whole purpose of this product was to be as simple as possible. And so it doesn't have that. It only has speaker outputs. It's a limitation, but it's one that, as I said, a line level converter can fix. Now, in terms of features, I'm just going to go through the list right now. So it uses a powerful and efficient Class D amplifier. The one that I have is the Juke 6, which is 6 zones and 12 amplifier channels. There is also an 8-channel version, or I'm sorry, an 8 zone version, which is 16 channels. For applications requiring more than 8 zones, multiple Jukes can work together automatically. So you could put a 6 and an 8 together, and that gives you 14 zones. Now, you can only play up to 4 sources simultaneously, but at least in my experience, that's never been a limiting factor. The number of users is unlimited, because again, it's AirPlay. Wireless input types, as I mentioned, are AirPlay. That's the primary way you can do that. And I use my iPhone and my iPad. I also have used my Mac laptop, and that's worked fine, and those are all options. Spotify Connect is supported. And then there are some apps you can put on Android devices that work with AirPlay. I found the reliability of those to have gotten better over time, but for the most part to be so-so at best. So you can always try that, and if it works, great. And if not, they are working to add in more Android support, but this is what you have for now. Now there's a very easy to use web interface that I talked about before, and that's how you set everything up, do installation, all the admin features are there, changing zones, things like that. You can stream audio to any combination of zones simultaneously within the limits of the fact that you have 8 zones in the case of mine, 6 zones in the case of mine, up to 8, and then also the 4 sources. There is the ability to add the 2 line level inputs that I mentioned using the adapter. And it could be connected to a surround sound amplifier using an optional USB interface, and that's the one that I showed before. Product's dimensions are 15 by 8 by 3 inches. So it's 15 inches wide, 8 inches deep, and 3 inches tall. It's really small. It only weighs 6 pounds. It's very lightweight. There are rack ears that are available for it to allow mounting in a 19-inch equipment rack. Now, in my case, I just stuck it on a shelf. The maximum ambient temperature that it supports is 40 degrees Celsius, which is high enough that you can use it. I mean, here I have it in a rack. There is ventilation in that rack room when the door is closed, and there are no issues. It doesn't really get hot. It has a universal power supply and supports 90 to 264 volts AC. It meets UL, TUV, CCC, EAC standards. It's approved in those. It's up to 95% efficient. Now the efficiency is going to depend on how many amplifier channels you're utilizing and at what power level. Class D amplifiers tend to be more efficient as you get towards the limit of their output. And it can withstand a surge of 300 volts for 5 seconds. It can require up to 600 watts of power. That's maximum. You're not going to probably be using that a lot. But again, remember that I'm guessing that number may be true for all of them, but that it doesn't say in the spec sheet. So that's either for the Juke 8 only, or possibly the Juke 6 and the Juke 8 share the same power supply. I'm not really sure. It has speaker connectors on the back, no line level connectors, and it uses the those green screw down type connector blocks. They're pretty easy to use. They support anywhere from 12 to 22 gauge. You need to strip the wire to fit in there. You can't really use binding post connectors or banana plugs or anything like that. You're kind of stuck with it, but for this purpose is fine. It's not really an issue. You can actually parallel speakers to a single zone if you want to, as long as the impedance remains at 2 ohms or above. And this is more commonly done with outdoor speakers, patio speakers, or in really large rooms where you've got a whole bunch of speakers in a row. In my setup, I haven't done that, but I do plan to add a patio sound system that uses these little kind of pendant-like speakers that go around the pool area. I still don't plan to do that because I have enough extra zones here that I want the extra amplification, but it is an option. There are 4 pluggable 8-position terminal blocks with 0.2-inch spacing. So that's those green blocks I was telling you about. It does have output current limiting, output short circuit protection, over temperature, under voltage, and over voltage. All of that is built in, and that protection is built into the Class D amplifier chip, and so it's very robust. As I mentioned, the amplifier power isn't all that great. So it's 40 watts peak per channel, 80 watts peak per zone, but the RMS power is really only about 20 watts, 40 watts per zone. And the aggregate output power of zones operated simultaneously, in other words, what you get across the board, 400 watts peak. So one of the reasons why I said if you've got a lot of speakers and you have the extra zones, I would just use those by plugging individual speakers into those because you'll get more power that way. I looked at the spec sheet, so I've promised not to share what amplifier chip they use, but I did get a hold of that and I looked at the spec sheet. You don't really get a ton more output by reducing the impedance, so I still think you're better off using multiple speakers across multiple amplifiers than you are to try to do multiple speakers on a single amplifier and reducing the impedance. As for how you can connect it to the network, you can use Ethernet via RJ45. We always recommend that. It's a lot more robust. But if you don't have that as an option, it does support Wi-Fi using WPA2. And they have a note in here. It says the Juke should be within 10 to 15 feet of an access point. Otherwise, they recommend using a TP-Link N300 and connecting Juke to its Ethernet port. So in other words, they're letting you know, yes, it has Wi-Fi built in. It's not the best Wi-Fi in the world. And so if it is really far from an access point, you may not have reliable service. In fact, one of the things I'll just mention while talking about that is that mine is plugged into RJ45. The Juke device itself has been completely bulletproof in that regard. However, because I am using AirPlay and I am using it outside, if I walk too far away from the house and I have my phone in my pocket, the sound stops. It's one of the negatives of using AirPlay as your source. One of the easy solutions is just don't use your phone as the source. Use another device like an iPad or a computer. Now, in terms of the internal computer, and as I mentioned, this basically is a computer with an amplifier connected to a lot of amplifiers. It refers to it as having a lot of horsepower for future firmware features and additions. It's one of the reasons why between when they first released this device and today, they were able to upgrade from AirPlay to AirPlay 2. But it also means they could add things like the DSP features I mentioned. So it has a quad-core 1.2 gigahertz processor and 1 gigabyte of RAM. Given the lightness of the software that's on this, what they're basically telling you is that that's not a very powerful processor, but it's way more than it needs for what it's trying to do. The firmware that's on it is flash-based, and it can be upgrades are possible over the air. And in fact, they've pushed upgrades to my device since I got it, and it's been completely bulletproof. The device doesn't go down unless the network goes down. So I have had some situations where my network was going down because we were kind of figuring out some of the features on it and had some reliability problems at first. Once we got that straightened out, even if the internet goes down, as long as the source is on my phone, I can still stream music to it. That seems to work fine. However, most of what I do uses streaming services, so if I was to lose internet, yeah, the device doesn't work anymore. But outside of that, the thing has been totally reliable. Haven't had any issues. When they pushed the update to it, it just worked. I mean, basically the guy told me he was pushing it, and within an hour when I went back to use it again, I could see all the new features. So it was very cool. So this device has been, I think, really wonderful to use, really easy. It's really affordable. As I said, I've been really impressed by the pricing on the product. So yeah, let's talk about pricing for a moment here. So the 6-zone version, which has 12 amplifier channels at 20 watts per channel, is $1,199. The 8-zone version, which has 16 channels at 20 watts per channel, is $1,399. Now, if you go and you look at other products like this, what you'll find is that for around the same price point, you'll get something with similar or maybe a little bit more rated power. Whether it really has it or not is debatable because some people use the peak output rating of the chip. They're going to charge maybe $1,000 or a little bit less with no sources at all. So you've got to add that. Now, the cheapest way that I know to add AirPlay as a source would be spending roughly $100 per AirPlay 2 device. So if you do 4 of those, that's $400. So if you have a $600 amplifier and then you add 4 of these sources to it at $400, you're now looking at $1,000 for something that isn't all put together and is much harder to use, including there would be no app control of the device itself. So you'd have to have remotes for that. If you get into something where you've got an amplifier that actually has app control of the amplifier itself, allowing you to change source and zone from your phone, and then also has sources built in like AirPlay, you're typically looking at more like $1,500 on up for something of similar quality with that number of zones. So really you're looking at something here that's a lot cheaper. I would say at least $300 to $400 cheaper than what you can get. And that would be looking at probably more no-name brands or brands that aren't, let's say, high-end audio companies, such as Dayton Audio, Monoprice, those types of companies. Get into a brand like Martin Logan or Paradigm, which are basically the same product. You're looking at $2,000 to $3,000 on up. Yamaha also makes a product that's in that range. And so when you start to get into the big audio brands, to get this level of source control and number of amplifier channels, while you'll probably get better sound and more output from those products, you're going to be looking at spending typically 2 or 3 times as much money. So I think when you consider the price and you consider the features, This is a really nice product. And I think that it's gotten so easy anymore to be able to wire up houses during construction, or in some cases to wire them after the fact. A lot of people have access to attics or crawl spaces that allow them to run wires, that this may actually be a really interesting alternative to something like a Sonos product, where essentially you have to plug it in, it's in the room, you can see it. If you could just put some speakers in your ceiling and wire it up to this, you get the same ease of use, potentially better sound if you use really good in-ceiling speakers, and really at a similar price point when you consider the number of channels. I mean, again, $1,200 for this amplifier with 12 amplifier channels. When you consider how many speakers you could wire up with that, you could really get a lot of sound, which would be a lot of output and for background listening. So overall, I think the Juke Audio is a really cool product. I actually had requested it for review, meaning that rather than somebody coming to me and saying, would you like to review this? I had gone online and looked for products that would meet my needs. I found this. I thought it was cool, didn't know anything about it. I was a little concerned about the limitations, but for the price, I thought I would buy this myself potentially. It just seemed like a good solution to my problem, which was that I was planning to add, I wired up for 8 zones. So I wired up for 8 zones in total. And I was worried about how I was going to power those 8 zones. And I didn't have a great solution. I couldn't really afford to buy something. I wasn't lucky enough that anyone was going to be sending me an 8-zone high-end amplifier for free. And so when I saw this product, I thought this would be good enough for what I'm trying to do. The price is reasonable. I probably could afford it. But the company actually was interested in getting some coverage of their product because it's fairly new. And so I reached out and I said, well, we could do that. I will review this product. I'll see how good it really is. It's actually something I was interested in anyway. And that's really how this review came to be. So I think that's telling that I was looking for something like this, found this on my own, thought it looked interesting, and said, hey, why don't we review this and see if this really is, all it's cracked up to be. The pros is it's a very simple device. It's affordably priced for what it is. It's got 4 sources built in. They can be AirPlay, they can be Spotify Connect, or they can be an external analog input. That's unique to have that in these types of devices, especially at this price point. The version I have is the 6, which is 6 zones, 12 amplifier channels. So again, on the Pro side, that's a lot of zones for that much money in a very compact chassis. It's a very efficient Class D amplifier for all of that. So easy to use, easy to set up, doesn't require professional installation, and it's got a lot of zones, a lot of amplifier outputs for people who have a lot of speakers. Cons, it is only 20 watts, and you can hear the limitations of the 20 watts. So if you're really trying to rock out with some inefficient, really big, bassy speakers, these aren't going to probably be enough for you. Having said that, that is me, and yet I'm finding this thing to be plenty enjoyable. So while I probably will use some higher power external amplifiers with certain things, like I certainly wouldn't power a subwoofer off of this, for all of the in-ceiling speakers that I've put in, this has turned out to be totally fine, and it's what I plan to use. So I think for a lot of people, this really would be okay. And by keeping it at only 20 watts per channel, it allows this thing to stay small, not produce a lot of heat, and be affordable. If they even doubled the power output, which is really what you would need to be meaningful, you'd be looking at a device that probably needs to be significantly larger, 50% to 100% bigger. It very well may need a fan for cooling. It's going to consume a lot more energy. And the cost probably wouldn't be 10 or 20% more. It probably would be 50% more expensive to be able to do that. So I think that they struck a good balance by keeping the power levels low, but high enough to be adequate. It allowed them to price the thing appropriately, keep it easy to use, and really make it attainable for most people. So overall, I recommend the product, even with the limitations I mentioned. I don't really think that there's any major flaws in it. I think that the interface is easy to use. I find it fine. Haven't had any issues with that. I love AirPlay. I actually have been finding that to be a better way. I have other ways of doing multi-zone audio. I have some devices that are dedicated for that purpose that tend to be used. I have Control4, for instance. I believe through the Control4 that I have a total of 6 separate sources that I can do because I have 2 Control4 controllers. And I find, even though the sound quality of the Control4 is much better, I find the ease of use of AirPlay to be much better, and I prefer that over the Control4 device. So while for multi-zone, like audiophile audio, yeah, I would use something like the Control4 device. For multi-room background audio, which is 99% of how I do the multi-room audio, this is really, I think, a better product, the Juke Audio and AirPlay as a source. Until next time, keep listening.